We all walk around with these incredibly powerful, glass rectangles in our pockets. We talk constantly about our data living up in the cloud. We sit in coffee shops, seamlessly streaming high-definition video over invisible Wi-Fi networks, and we've developed this absolute collective illusion that our information is just magically floating in the ether.
Right, like it's just hovering around us.
Exactly, that it's weightless, that it's wireless. But the reality, it's all a lie. Cloud computing, your Wi-Fi, the entire global structure of the modern internet, it is entirely, completely dependent on physical, heavily armored tubes lying deep in the freezing mud at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, the cloud isn't in the sky at all.
No, the cloud is quite literally under the sea.
It's a beautifully grounding realization, isn't it? I mean, the dematerialization of our digital world is nothing but a psychological trick we play on ourselves. The physical reality of the internet is shockingly industrial. It's intensely physical and, honestly, highly vulnerable.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to this deep dive. Whether you're prepping for a major tech meeting, trying to catch up on the history of telecommunications, or just insanely curious about how the world actually physically connects, this is for you.
Absolutely.
Our mission today, pulling from a really comprehensive encyclopedic history of telecommunications, is to uncover this mind-blowing narrative. We're going to figure out how Victorian-era engineers, wearing, wool coats and battling the crushing, terrifying abyss of the open ocean, laid the exact physical and conceptual groundwork for the internet you and I are using right this second.
It fundamentally reframes our relationship with technology, I think. We always think of the internet as a 21st century or maybe a late 20th century invention.
Right, like dial-up modems.
And logic, the error correction, the geographic pathways, and the sheer physical engineering required to send information across the globe, that was all hammered out by people operating in the 1850s.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's rewind to the 19th century, the Victorian era. The overland telegraph has just been invented, and it's a total revolution. Samuel Morse, Alfred Vail, and others have figured out how to send electrical pulses over copper wires strung across wooden poles.
Which was basically magic to people back then.
Oh, completely. Suddenly, human communication goes from the speed of a galloping horse to the speed of light. Messages travel across continents in minutes instead of weeks. But then, this unstoppable march of progress hits a literal and metaphorical wall, which is the ocean.
And it was a wall that many of the greatest scientific minds of the era thought was genuinely insurmountable. You have to remember, the terrestrial telegraph was an absolute engineering marvel, but it operated in a relatively benign environment.
Sure, it's just on land.
Right. You put a wooden pole in the dirt. You string a copper wire, you insulate it with a little glass knob so the current doesn't ground out into the pole, and it mostly works. I mean, assuming a storm doesn't blow the pole over. The ocean, however, is unequivocally the most hostile environment on planet Earth for an electrical system.
Well, yeah, because electricity and water notoriously do not mix. If you just drop a bare copper wire into the Atlantic, the electrical pulse you send is just going to immediately dissipate into the seawater, right? The ocean is essentially one giant ground wire.
Exactly. Seawater is incredibly conductive because of the dissolved salts, but the conductivity is really just the beginning of the nightmare.
What else were they dealing with?
Well, if you are a Victorian engineer trying to span the Atlantic, you are facing immense hydrostatic water pressure. We are talking thousands of pounds per square inch that can crush a submarine, let alone a delicate little wire.
Wow.
You also have highly corrosive salt water eating away at your metals. You have completely unpredictable, massive deep-sea currents that can just drag and snap your lines. And you have a seabed that isn't just flat sand. It's filled with jagged underwater mountain ranges, deep trenches, and highly abrasive rocks.
It's just a gauntlet. But even before you get to the physical damage, the core problem is just getting the signal from point A to point B, right?
Yeah.
If I send an electrical pulse from, say, Ireland, trying to reach Newfoundland, what actually happens to that electricity in the water?
From a physics perspective, you are fighting the demon of attenuation.
Attenuation, okay.
Yeah. When you send an electrical pulse through any conductive medium, the signal naturally weakens over distance. There is inherent resistance in the copper wire itself. So the energy of that electrical pulse wants to leak out. It wants to dissipate into the surrounding environment.
Just bleeds away.
Exactly. So over hundreds or thousands of miles of cable, the signal scatters, it loses its amplitude, and simply fades to nothing.
So it's not like water flowing through a pipe where what goes in must come out. It's more like trying to shine a flashlight through a mile of murky sediment-filled water.
Oh, that's a perfect way to picture it.
Right at the lens of the flashlight. The light is blindingly bright. But as it travels through the water, the light diffuses, it hits the particles of dirt, it scatters in every direction, and eventually, long before a mile is up, the beam is just completely gone. You wouldn't even see a flicker on the other side.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The electrical signal diffuses into the ocean exactly like those photons of light diffuse into the murky water. The signal strength drops exponentially the further it travels.
So if copper wire alone shorts out immediately in seawater, and the signal just fades away, how on earth did they insulate it? I mean, we were talking about the 1850s here. They don't have modern plastics.
No plastics at all.
Right. There's no Teflon, there's no polyethylene, and you can't just wrap it in standard rubber because rubber degrades in seawater, doesn't it?
It does. It perishes very quickly.
So what material could possibly survive the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and keep the electricity inside the wire?
It required a miraculous material science breakthrough, and interestingly, it was provided entirely by nature. The whole global telecommunications network was made possible by the sap of a very specific tree.
Wait, a tree?
Yeah, a tree. It was a substance called gutta-percha.
Gutta-percha? That sounds like a made-up magical item from a fantasy novel. What exactly is it?
It was very real and absolutely vital. Gutta-percha is a natural, rubber-like sap extracted from trees native to Southeast Asia, specifically in regions like Malaysia and Indonesia.
Huh?
Now, you mentioned regular rubber earlier. Regular rubber, like latex, is an elastomer. It's elastic, it stretches, and crucially, in its natural state, it breaks down quickly when exposed to air, light, and temperature changes.
Right, like how old rubber bands get super brittle and just snap.
Exactly. But gutta-percha is chemically different at a molecular level. It is a rigid thermoplastic polymer.
Thermoplastic.
Yeah, which means that at room temperature, it's hard and stiff, almost like wood. But when you submerge it in hot water, it becomes incredibly pliable, soft, and easy to mold. And then when it cools back down, it solidifies again. It was basically the Victorian-era's version of injection molded plastic.
Oh, wow. That's incredibly convenient for manufacturing.
Highly convenient. But its mechanical properties aren't why it changed the world. It changed the world because it possesses remarkable water resistance. It literally does not degrade in cold seawater. In fact, the freezing depths of the ocean preserve it perfectly. And most importantly, it has exceptional dielectric properties.
Dielectric. Let's break that down for the listener. That basically means it acts as a near-perfect insulator, right?
Exactly.
So it prevents the electrical current from leaking out of the copper wire and into the ocean. It keeps the beam of the flashlight inside the tube.
Precisely. A dielectric material is a poor conductor of electricity, but it supports electrostatic fields. It was the perfect, flawless Victorian insulator. The manufacturing process was pretty brutal but effective. They would heat the raw gutta-percha sap, extrude it through these massive iron machines, and wrap it tightly around the central copper conductor in multiple seamless layers.
Okay, so I'm picturing the anatomy of these early submarine cables. At the very center, you have the heart of the whole operation, which is a braided copper conductor. That's the actual pathway for the electricity.
Right.
Then you wrap that copper heavily in this heated, molded gutta-percha sap. But surely they couldn't just drop that into the ocean. Gutta-percha might be hard, but if it drags across a jagged underwater rock, it's going to slice right open.
You're absolutely right. The gutta-percha perfectly protected the electrical signal, but the gutta-percha itself needed robust physical protection from the brutality of the ocean floor. So they had to build layers upon layers of defense. Over the gutta-percha, they applied thick wrappings of jute.
Jute, like the rough plant fiber they used to make burlap sacks.
Exactly that. They used jute because it was cheap, it was tough, and it provided a thick layer of physical cushioning. But jute rots in water, so they would heavily impregnate and coat the jute in sticky, waterproof tar or asphalt.
So now you have copper, gutta-percha, and tar-soaked burlap.
Right.
But that still wouldn't survive being dropped from a ship, would it? The water pressure alone? Or just the tension of hanging thousands of feet down?
No, which is why the final layer was the most crucial for the cable's physical survival, and that was the armor. The final outer layer was a robust, spiraling cage of heavily galvanized steel or iron wires twisted around the entire assembly. This gave the cable its immense tensile strength.
Tensile strength meaning its ability to resist being pulled apart.
Right, because when a ship is sailing across the Atlantic, paying out cable off the stern, that cable is dropping through 2 or 3 miles of open water before it ever hits the bottom. The ship isn't just laying the cable down gently. The cable is hanging in the water column.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the weight of 3 miles of iron, copper, and gutta-percha hanging vertically is staggering. If the cable didn't have incredible tensile strength, it would snap under its own massive weight before it ever touched the mud.
So they essentially built a highly specialized underwater electrical garden hose wrapped in tree sap, burlap, and steel armor. But one thing I've always wondered about this, the ocean isn't uniform. The shallow waters near the beach are totally different from the abyssal plains in the middle of the Atlantic. Did they just make one giant uniform cable and hope for the best?
That's a brilliant question, and it points to a really fascinating environmental adaptation by these early engineers. They learned very quickly, usually through catastrophic, terribly expensive failures, that a one-size-fits-all approach just wouldn't work.
Makes sense.
The greatest danger to an undersea cable isn't actually the crushing depths of the abyssal plain. The greatest danger is in the shallow coastal waters, precisely because of human activity.
Of course. Ships dropping anchors, fishing nets.
Exactly. In shallow water, say, coming off the coast of Ireland or landing in Newfoundland, the cables required massive, incredibly thick, heavily clustered steel armor to survive being snagged by dragging ship anchors or scraped by fishing trawls or even just pounded against the rocks by tidal surges.
So the ends were beefed up.
Very much so. The shallow water sections of the cable, known as the shore ends, were incredibly heavy, thick, and rigid. They basically looked like massive iron tree trunks.
But if you made the whole transatlantic cable that thick,
Yeah.
no ship in the world could carry enough of it, right? It would just be way too heavy.
Precisely. The Great Eastern, which was the largest ship in the world at the time, could barely hold the standard cable. A shore-end cable the whole way was just physically impossible. But here is the saving grace. Once the cable descended past the continental shelf and reached the deep sea 3 miles down, the environment changes completely.
How so?
It is freezing, it is pitch black, and most importantly, it is incredibly still.
Because there are no waves, no tides, and definitely no ship anchors down there.
Right. It's basically an undisturbed desert of soft mud. So the engineers designed the deep sea sections of the cable to be vastly different. They used much lighter armor, much thinner steel wires. This made the deep sea cable vastly lighter, highly flexible, and far easier for the ships to coil in their massive holds and safely pay out over the stern.
It's so elegant.
Yeah.
You armor it heavily where humies can break it, and you make it light and flexible where the ocean is calm. But, having the perfect design in a factory in London is one thing. Actually, unspooling thousands of miles of this stuff across the wildest ocean on Earth is a completely different beast.
Oh, without a doubt.
Which brings us to the human drama. Between 1857 and 1866, the attempt to cross the Atlantic was essentially the Victorian equivalent of the Apollo moon landing.
It absolutely was the space race of the 19th century. The sheer audacity of it is kind of hard to overstate. The idea of linking North America and Europe with a single unbroken wire was widely considered impossible by many eminent, highly educated scientists of the day.
They just thought it was a pipe dream.
They did. They thought the pressure would crush it, or the currents would snap it, or the signals simply wouldn't travel that far, even with the gutta-percha.
But there was one guy who just refused to accept that it was impossible. Cyrus West Field. He was an American paper manufacturing tycoon who retired wealthy at, age 34, got bored, and decided he was going to wire the world.
Cyrus West Field was a fascinating figure. He was truly possessed by this vision. And what's wild is he wasn't a scientist, he wasn't an engineer, and he knew essentially nothing about electricity.
Really, just a business guy.
Just a visionary businessman who inherently understood the immense economic, political, and cultural value of instantaneous transatlantic communication. He knew that whoever connected London and New York would literally change history.
And make an absolute fortune doing it.
Unimaginable wealth, yes. So Field used his sheer force of personality to raise massive amounts of capital from both American and British investors, governments, and wealthy individuals to fund this consortium.
The scale of what he funded is just mind-boggling. We are talking about retrofitting the largest warships and merchant vessels in the world, manufacturing thousands of tons of this heavily armored gutta-percha cable, and coordinating this incredibly delicate, highly dangerous payout process in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where a single storm could destroy years of work.
And I often did.
Let's walk through the timeline. because it is essentially a timeline of total heartbreak, millions of dollars wasted, and crushing failure before they finally succeed. They make their first real, fully funded attempt in 1857. What happens?
It is a swift and devastating failure. They load up 2 ships, they start laying the cable from the coast of Ireland moving westward. And for a few days, things go well. The cable is unspooling, messages are being sent back to shore to test the line. But then, partway into the ocean, a sudden dip in the stern of the ship due to the ocean swell, combined with a momentary lockup in the mechanical pang outbreaks.
Oh no, the tension spikes.
The tension spikes drastically. The cable simply snaps under its own immense weight. The broken end plunges into the abyss and just disappears forever. Millions of dollars of investor capital literally sunk in an instant.
That would destroy most people. But Field just regroups. He goes back to the investors, begs for more money, they redesign the mechanical payout machinery to have better shock absorbers, and they try again the very next year in 1858. And this time, it works. Well, kinda. It's remembered as the success that wasn't.
Yeah, 1858 is one of the most dramatically ironic chapters in the history of technology. They actually managed to lay the cable all the way across. They had 2 ships start in the middle of the ocean, splice the ends together, and sail in opposite directions to their respective shores.
And it connects. The historic moment is incredible. Queen Victoria in London and U.S. President James Buchanan in Washington, D.C. actually exchange a formal congratulatory telegraph message. Now, because the signal is weak, it takes something like 16 hours to transmit a 99-word message. But it happens.
It did happen, and the public reaction was absolute hysteria.
There are massive parades down Broadway in New York, fireworks lighting up the sky, church bells ringing constantly. People are giving sermons saying that the telegraph has eradicated war forever because humanity is now a single, unified consciousness.
The euphoria was totally unprecedented. But what's fascinating here is what was happening in the dark, cramped telegraph operating rooms while the public was outside setting off those fireworks. Technically speaking, the 1858 cable was dying from the very moment they plugged it in. It only lasted a matter of weeks before going completely dead.
Why? I've never fully understood this part. If the physical wire was completely intact and it wasn't snapped by a ship or crushed by a rock, why did it just die?
Because of a colossal, fundamentally arrogant misunderstanding of electrical physics by the project's chief electrician, a man named Dr. Wildman Whitehouse.
Wait, a medical doctor?
Yes, a former surgeon who fancied himself an electrical pioneer.
Right.
As we discussed earlier with your flashlight analogy, the signal attenuates. Over 2,000 miles of ocean, it gets incredibly weak. The operators at the receiving end were staring at their galvanometers, desperately struggling to read these faint, wavering signals. Whitehouse, who is operating on totally flawed self-taught theories and explicitly ignoring the advice of brilliant physicists like Lord Kelvin, believed that the solution to a weak, fading signal was simply to force massive amounts of raw power into the line.
Ah, I see. It's the brute force approach. It's like realizing your garden hose isn't quite reaching the end of the yard. So instead of buying a wider hose, you just hook the thing up to a high-pressure city fire hydrant.
That is exactly what he did. Whitehouse was frustrated by the weak signal, so he connected massive, room-sized induction coils to the system. He decided to blast the delicate undersea cable with extreme, highly excessive voltage. Estimates suggest he was pumping upwards of 2,000 volts into the line to try and punch the message through to North America.
2,000 volts. Now, think back to the anatomy of the cable. What was the insulator?
It was the gutta-percha, the tree sap.
Right. Gutta-percha was a miraculous insulator for low-voltage standard telegraphy. Yeah. But it was absolutely not designed to withstand a 2,000-volt assault.
Not at all. Whitehouse's extreme voltage literally cooked the cable from the inside out. He exceeded the dielectric breakdown voltage of the gutta-percha. He literally blew microscopic holes right through the insulation.
So the fire hydrant pressure blew a hole in the side of the garden hose.
Exactly. And once a hole was blown through the gutta-percha, the highly conductive seawater rushed in, touched the bare copper, and the electrical current immediately shorted out into the ocean. The line went permanently, irreversibly dead.
Yeah.
And the public, who had just been celebrating this miracle of the age, suddenly heard nothing. They went from jubilation to furious anger, assuming Cyrus West Field had perpetrated a massive financial hoax.
That is just brutal, to have it work just long enough for the Queen and the President to exchange pleasantries, and then your own lead engineer just fries your multi-million-dollar cable because he wouldn't listen to the physicists.
A very expensive lesson.
But again, Cyrus West Field refuses to die. The sheer persistence of this man and his team, is legendary.
It took years to recover from the 1858 disaster. He had to rebuild his reputation, raise the capital all over again, and all of this was severely delayed by the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861.
Right, bad timing.
Very bad.
Hmm?
But the delay was actually a blessing in disguise because they learned from White House's catastrophic failure. They fired him.
Good move.
They put brilliant scientific minds, particularly Lord Kelvin, in charge of the physics. Kelvin understood that you don't need high voltage, you need better conductivity and incredibly sensitive receivers. So they used better, purer, thicker copper to lower the resistance. They used much thicker layers of high-quality gutta-percha. And Kelvin invented the mirror galvanometer, which was an incredibly sensitive instrument that could read the faintest, lowest voltage electrical whispers coming out of the ocean.
And this leads to the ultimate triumph. In 1866, using the massive ship, the Great Eastern, they not only successfully lay a brand new, highly robust, perfectly working cable, but they do something even more mind-blowing. The year prior, in 1865, they had made an attempt that snapped halfway across. In 1866, they navigate back to the exact spot in the middle of a completely featureless ocean, drop a massive grappling hook thousands of meters down into the pitch-black abyss, somehow catch the broken 2-inch thick wire, haul it all the way up, splice it to a new line on the deck, and finish laying that one too. They end up with 2 continuous working links.
I cannot emphasize enough how difficult that was. Grappling a 2-inch thick wire in 2.5 miles of open water, relying on purely analog navigation and celestial dead reckoning in 1866, it is frankly one of the greatest feats of maritime engineering in human history.
It sounds impossible.
They dragged the hook back and forth for days, just feeling the tension on the winch. When they finally hooked it and brought it to the surface, the crew literally wept. That moment proved that not only could a cable be successfully laid and operated without frying it, but crucially, it proved it could be found and repaired if it broke.
Which changes the whole business model.
Exactly. It made the entire enterprise commercially viable for investors because a broken cable was no longer a total loss.
So the physical cable was finally down, it was working, and it wasn't being fried by a mad scientist. But the ocean wasn't quite done throwing obstacles at them. It turned out the deep sea was playing highly complex physics tricks on the electrical signals themselves, which actually forced a radical emergency change in the very language of technology. This brings us to a massive turning point, which is the capacitance crisis and the evolution of digital code.
This is perhaps my favorite part of the story, because this is where the intersection of the physical environment and what we would today call software becomes incredibly clear. We intuitively think of the ocean as just a physical barrier, water and pressure. But it actually altered the fundamental electrical properties of the circuit in a profound, highly disruptive way.
Right. Because of how the cable was constructed and where it was located, the transatlantic cables acted as massive electrical capacitors. Now, I know the word capacitor from circuit boards, but can you explain what that actually means in this giant transoceanic context? How does a cable become a capacitor?
Certainly. Let's break down the basic physics of a capacitor. A capacitor is an electrical component designed to store energy in an electric field. The simplest way to build one is to take 2 conductive metal plates and separate them with a thin layer of an insulator, which we call a dielectric.
Like the gutta-percha.
We'll get there, yes. When you apply voltage to one plate, the electric charge builds up there. It creates a field across the insulator, and it induces an opposite charge on the other plate. It stores the energy.
Okay, 2 metal plates with an insulator in the middle. Got it.
Right. Now zoom out and look at the physical structure of the undersea telegraph cable. You have a long, continuous copper wire running down the very center that acts as your inner conductive plate. You have a thick wrapping of gutta-percha tightly surrounding it, that is your dielectric insulator. And the entire thing is submerged in thousands of miles of highly conductive, salty ocean water. The ocean itself acts as the outer second conductive plate.
So the entire Atlantic Ocean is acting as one side of a battery, basically.
Essentially, yes. The physical design of the cable, combined with the environment of the ocean, turned the entire 2,000-mile transatlantic line into one giant unintentional capacitor. And this caused a massive, paralyzing problem for the telegraph signals, a phenomenon known in physics as signal dispersion.
How does that actually mess up the signal?
Well, think about how a telegraph works. When an operator in Ireland presses down on a telegraph key, they are trying to send a sharp, distinct, square-shaped electrical pulse. A binary 1 or 0, a dot or a dash. On a short terrestrial landline stretched on poles through the air, that pulse travels cleanly. It arrives at the other end as a sharp, instantaneous click.
Right.
But on a highly capacitive submarine cable, that sharp pulse is fundamentally altered. When you send the voltage in, the cable capacitor immediately tries to absorb and store that energy before letting it pass through.
Oh, I see. It smears it.
Exactly. It smears the electrical wave. The sharp vertical leading edge of the pulse gets stretched out. So a crisp fraction of a second dot sent from the transmitter in Ireland arrives at the receiver in Newfoundland, not as a sharp click, but as a long, indistinct, rolling wave of voltage.
That's like a nightmare to read.
It takes a long time for the voltage to slowly build up on the receiving end, and when the operator releases the key, it takes a long time for the stored voltage to slowly bleed off and decay.
It's like an acoustic echo in a massive cathedral. If you clap your hands sharply, you don't hear a sharp clap. You hear a booming wash of sound that takes seconds to fade away.
That is a perfect acoustic equivalent. The capacitance creates an electrical echo that muddies everything.
But if the signal is smeared like that, how on earth do you know what letter you're receiving? If a quick tap of the key turns into a long, blurry, continuous hum, how does the poor operator at the other end make any sense of it?
This was the exact crisis that hit the operating rooms in 1866. They couldn't read the messages accurately, and this crisis revealed a fatal, deeply ingrained flaw in the software they were using. Specifically, the original American Morse code invented by Samuel Morse and Alfred Vail decades earlier.
Wait, really? I always assumed Morse code was just, Morse code. It's universal, right? Dots and dashes. I didn't realize there were different versions or fatal flaws in it.
Oh, there were massive flaws. Original American Morse code was highly optimized for skilled operators listening to sharp clicks on clean, short terrestrial landlines. Because of this, it utilized something called spaced letters.
Spaced letters?
Yeah. This means that for certain letters, the code relied on internal pauses, literally microsecond spaces of silence within a single letter, to differentiate them from other letters.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Give me an example of how that works and how it fails.
Take the letter C in original American Morse. The code for C was 2 rapid dots, a brief microsecond pause, and a third dot, 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 pause, dot.
Okay, I follow.
Now imagine trying to send that delicate, rhythmically complex C over the transatlantic cable with massive capacitance. The ocean takes those sharp dots and smears them into rolling waves. That crucial, brief internal pause between the second and third dot gets completely filled in and erased by the electrical bleeding of the capacitor.
So the operator on the other end, staring at the galvanometer, doesn't see the pause. The echo fills the silence. What do they actually read?
Because the pause is smeared and erased, that letter C arrives looking entirely different. It could easily be misread as an I, which is 2 continuous dots, followed immediately by an E, which is 1 dot. Or if it smears together even worse, it could just look like a messy S, which is 3 continuous dots.
Wow. So an entire word, a critical financial stock quote, or a highly sensitive diplomatic order between governments could be completely changed, completely corrupted, just because the physical ocean erased a microsecond pause in the electrical wave.
Exactly. On a transoceanic cable that is carrying the most high-stakes diplomatic and financial data in the world, a communication system that relies on fragile internal spaces is a recipe for absolute disaster. The error rate was unacceptable. They were constantly having to ask for messages to be repeated, which cost a fortune and lost time. The physical reality of the ocean floor literally forced an emergency update to the software of human communication.
And what do they do? How do they fix the software?
They had to abandon American Morse for deep-sea work. The solution was a total shift to international Morse code. This new code was developed primarily by a brilliant German telegraph inspector named Friedrich Clemens Gurk. He had studied the flaws of American Morse, and he systematically went through the alphabet and eliminated every single spaced letter.
So absolutely no internal pauses whatsoever.
None. In Gurk's International Morse, every single character is represented by a continuous, unbroken string of dots and dashes, separated only by standard, uniform intervals of silence between the completed letters themselves.
So it's a much more robust, highly distinct rhythm, like a solid block of sound.
Exactly. It provided a steady, rhythmic consistency that could survive the severe distortion of the deep sea. Even if the signal was badly smeared by capacitance, a continuous solid block of 3 dots and a dash is much harder to mathematically misinterpret than a series of delicate dots with tiny, fragile, easily erased pauses hidden inside it. Gurk adapted the software, the code, to survive the inescapable noise of the physical hardware.
I am having a massive aha moment right now. Because if you think about it, what you just described, fixing the data protocol to survive a messy transmission medium, that is the exact foundational concept of how modern internet routing works today.
It absolutely is. It is the exact same principle. Guercke's International Morse code was essentially a 19th century error correction protocol.
Let me make sure I'm getting this right. Today, when you stream a 4K video on Netflix or send an email or load a web page, the data isn't sent as one continuous stream. It's broken down into millions of tiny packets of data. And as those data packets travel across copper wires, under the ocean in fiber optics, or through the air via Wi-Fi, they inevitably encounter noise, electrical interference, and packet loss. The physical hardware of the world is always noisy and messy.
Yes, the physical world is inherently chaotic.
So, to ensure the message arrives intact, computer scientists didn't try to make the physical cables or the Wi-Fi waves perfect, because you can't. Instead, they designed highly robust software protocols, like TCP, the Transmission Control Protocol, that anticipate the noise. TCP uses checksums and acknowledgement messages to detect if a packet was corrupted or lost in transit, and it automatically requests the sender to retransmit it. It adapts the software to survive the messy reality of the hardware.
Precisely. You cannot control the capacitance of the Atlantic Ocean, and you cannot control the atmospheric interference of a Wi-Fi signal. But you can control the logic of the data you send through it. The Victorian shift to International Morse code was the birth of that exact digital philosophy.
That is just incredible. Okay, so with the physical cable finally working, the voltage issue solved, and the digital code fixed to survive the ocean's capacitance, the Atlantic is firmly conquered. And once they proved it could be done, the Victorian internet exploded across the globe at an unbelievable pace. It fundamentally rewired human society.
The expansion was staggeringly rapid. Once the 1866 transatlantic cable proved that this was a commercially viable, highly profitable enterprise, massive amounts of capital flooded into the telecommunications industry.
Almost like the dot-com boom of the 1870s. We see this massive, rapid expansion. They lay cables deep across the Mediterranean Sea. They connect the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, which finally links London directly to Bombay, India. And then the ultimate frontier, the immense Pacific Ocean, is conquered in 1902, connecting North America to Asia via a route through Alaska and Siberia. Within a few decades, the entire globe is literally being wrapped in a web of copper wire and tree sap.
It was, without exaggeration, the largest and most complex infrastructure project the human race had ever undertaken up to that point in history.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Laying the cable is only half the story. Once you lay the cable, the job isn't done. Maintaining this global nervous system was a gritty, relentless, and incredibly dangerous reality. We tend to think of infrastructure as static. You build a steel bridge, you pave a highway, and it basically stays there. But an undersea cable is highly vulnerable.
Oh, highly vulnerable. A submarine cable was not a set-it-and-forget-it piece of technology. Cables broke constantly.
How often is constantly, and what was breaking them?
Depending on the location, a line could go down several times a year. They broke due to massive undersea landslides that would snap the wire like twine. They broke due to violent weather and shifting currents chafing the armor against rocks. As we discussed, they were frequently hooked and dragged by merchant ship anchors, and just plain chemical corrosion would eventually find a weak spot in the tar and eat through the steel armor.
So the global network was constantly fraying, which brings up a huge logistical question. If a cable snaps in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, how on earth do you find a tiny 2-inch thick wire in 2 miles of water? You can't just send a guy down in a submarine to look around.
No, you can't. And this is where Victorian electrical engineering truly shines. The operators at the shore stations had a brilliant method for finding the break without ever leaving their desks. They used advanced electrical resistance measurements.
Okay, break that down for me. How does measuring electricity tell you distance?
It relies on a fundamental principle called Ohm's law. The engineers knew exactly how much electrical resistance a single mile of their copper cable naturally possessed. Let's say, hypothetically, the cable has a natural resistance of 10 ohms per mile. And let's say the total distance to the other side is 1,000 miles. So a healthy, intact cable should show 10,000 ohms of total resistance on their testing meters.
Right, I follow that.
Now, a violent undersea landslide happens, the cable snaps 400 miles away, and the bare copper is exposed to the highly conductive seawater. The electricity no longer travels 1,000 miles to the other station. It travels 400 miles and immediately shorts out into the ocean ground. The operator at the shore station tests the line using a device called a Wheatstone bridge, which precisely measures resistance. Instead of reading 10,000 ohms, the meter reads exactly 4,000 ohms.
Ah, because 4,000 ohms divided by 10 ohms per mile equals exactly 400 miles. So they know instantly mathematically that the break is 400 miles offshore. That is genius.
It is brilliant, mathematically elegant troubleshooting. But while the math was elegant, the physical reality of the repair was a nightmare. The math only gave them a general radius, a point on a map.
Right, because 400 miles out could mean anywhere along a massive arc, depending on how the cable was originally laid. So what's the next step?
A dedicated cable repair ship, and there was a whole global fleet of these weird specialized vessels, had to fire up its steam engines and sail out into the open ocean, often in terrible North Atlantic weather, to that approximate coordinate.
And then they have to fish for it.
Yes. They would lower massive, multi-pronged iron grappling gear on heavy steel ropes down into the abyss. They would sail to a point a few miles to one side of where they thought the cable lay, drop the hook, and slowly steam perpendicular across the presumed cable line, dragging the hook through the deep-sea mud. They might drag for days, day and night, in freezing rain, with men standing on the deck keeping their hands constantly on the massive winch ropes, literally trying to feel the mechanical tension change when the hook finally snagged the buried cable.
And when they finally hook it, they have to haul it all the way up to the surface.
Yeah.
The tension on that grappling line must have been unbelievable. If it snaps again on the way up, they have to start all over.
It was agonizing, dangerous work. And if they successfully brought the broken end to the surface, they buoyed it off, then went and grappled for the other broken end. When they had both ends on the ship, they had to splice them back together.
How do you do a high-tech electrical splice on the deck of a rolling ship in the 19th century?
It required incredible skill. The jointer, a highly specialized technician, would carefully strip back the heavy steel armor wires. He would expose the delicate copper core, painstakingly solder the two copper ends together to ensure a perfect electrical connection. Then he would heat up fresh gutta-percha with hot irons and carefully mold it around the joint, ensuring there were absolutely no air bubbles or imperfections where water could leak in. Then they reapplied the tarred jute, and finally, they had to manually weave the heavy steel armor wires back together over the joint.
That's intense.
All of this is happening while the ship is pitching and rolling in the ocean swells, and thousands of pounds of tension are pulling on the cable.
It's amazing to think about the intense, physical blue-collar labor required to maintain a system that felt like pure, frictionless magic to the people using it on shore. Why were they pushing so hard? What was driving this incredible investment of capital and this willingness to risk human lives in freezing storms?
The geopolitical drivers were immense, and they fundamentally reorganized world power. For imperial nations, particularly the British Empire, these cables were the ultimate tools of governance, military logistics, and control.
Because before the telegraph, the empire was vast but incredibly slow. If a massive uprising or a crisis occurred in a distant colony like India, it could take a month for a ship to carry that news to London, and another month for London to send military orders back. The crisis would be over before the orders arrived.
Exactly. The empire was decentralized by the sheer friction of distance. But with the submarine cable, the British government in Whitehall could receive news of a conflict in Bombay, consult and issue military commands back to the local governors in a matter of hours. It centralized imperial power in an unprecedented, highly concentrated way. The cables were the literal strings that allowed the puppet masters in London to control a global empire in real time.
The world was shrinking rapidly.
Radically shrinking. And it wasn't just governments and militaries. Scientific expeditions exploring the far reaches of the globe could transmit their findings back to academic institutions in London or Paris almost immediately. Global weather data began to be shared, allowing for the first real meteorological forecasting. The timeline of global human interaction collapsed from weeks and months to minutes and hours.
But it wasn't just governments, generals, and scientists using these cables. The true revolution, the one that really impacts you and me today, happens in the daily lives of everyday citizens. It fundamentally changed how people consumed information, how they read the news, and how the global economy functioned. This incredible copper web rewired the human mind.
The sociological and economic fallout of instantaneous global communication was absolute, immediate, and irreversible.
Let's start with the media. Because information could suddenly travel instantly across oceans, newspaper publishers quickly realized they no longer had to wait weeks for ships to arrive carrying out-of-date newspapers from other countries. They could report on a war in Europe the very next day in New York. But there was a catch. The undersea telegraph was unimaginably expensive.
It was a luxury service. When the transatlantic cable finally stabilized in the late 1860s, the cost to send a single word was exorbitant. It was often equivalent to several days' wages for an average worker.
Because of that cost, individual newspapers couldn't afford to have their own dedicated reporters sending thousands of words across the cable every day. So they did something unprecedented. They pooled their resources, their money, and their information. This led directly to the birth of the newswire services. The Associated Press was formed by New York newspapers sharing Pony Express and early telegraph costs. And over in Europe, you have the famous founding of Reuters.
Paul Reuter is a fantastic example of a technological opportunist. He actually started his news service in 1851 by using flocks of highly trained carrier pigeons.
Pigeons.
Yeah, to bridge a specific gap in the terrestrial telegraph network between Aachen, Germany, and Brussels, Belgium, so he could deliver stock market prices faster than the trains. But as soon as the submarine cables began expanding, he completely abandoned the pigeons and aggressively moved his entire operation to the cables, building a global news empire based entirely on speed.
But the brutal economics of the undersea cable completely changed how journalists actually wrote. If you read a newspaper from the 1830s, the journalism is incredibly verbose. It's flowery, it's highly literary prose, it builds up slowly to a narrative climax. It reads like a Charles Dickens novel.
Yes, because space on a printed page was relatively cheap, and time wasn't a factor. But the telegraph killed literary journalism.
Because if you are a reporter in London and you're paying a massive premium in gold for every single word transmitted under the Atlantic Ocean to your editor in New York, you absolutely do not send lengthy poetic descriptions of the weather or long philosophical musings on the nature of the event.
No, you strip the language down to its absolute bare metal.
Exactly. Journalists were forced by the technology to invent a completely new format of writing, which is the inverted pyramid.
It's a structure that is still taught in journalism schools today.
Right. You put the most critical foundational facts, the who, what, when, where, and why, at the very top of the dispatch in the very first sentence. President Lincoln assassinated at Ford's Theater.
And why did they do that? Because if the transmission got interrupted by a sudden Atlantic storm taking down the line, or if the telegraph operator lost the signal in the capacitance noise, or, frankly, if the newspaper's financial budget for the transmission simply ran out mid-sentence, they needed to guarantee that the core, essential story got through first. The details and the background information were pushed to the bottom of the article, to be sent only if time and money allowed.
The physical and economic constraints of the network dictated the syntax and the format of human communication. It's so relatable to our modern world. It totally compares to the original character limit on early Twitter.
That is a very apt comparison.
When Twitter first launched, you were hard-capped at 140 characters because it was based on SMS text messaging limits. That severe constraint forced an entirely new, compressed, hyper-efficient style of human communication. It changed how people expressed complex thoughts, how jokes were structured, how news was broken. The technology forced the human mind to adapt its language. The undersea telegraph cable did the exact same thing to Victorian society.
The medium shapes the message, always. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, while the cable changed how we consume news, its impact on global finance and the structure of money was infinitely more profound.
The financial revolution. Before the cables were laid, the global economy was ruled by arbitrage.
Yes. Arbitrage, in its purest form, is the practice of taking advantage of a price difference for the same asset between two or more markets. And in a world where information moves at the speed of a sailing ship, arbitrage is incredibly lucrative.
Give me a practical example of how that worked.
Let's look at the cotton trade before 1866. Stock prices and commodity values varied wildly between the markets in New York and London because they were totally disconnected. If you were a savvy merchant and you had a fast ship that just arrived in New York from London, you might be the only person in America who knows that the textile mills in England are desperate for cotton and the price there has skyrocketed. Meanwhile, the traders in New York don't know this yet, so the price in New York is still very low.
So you buy up all the cheap cotton in New York, load it onto your slow cargo ships, and you make an absolute fortune when it finally arrives in London weeks later and sells at the high price.
Exactly. The entire system relied on the information gap. The wealth went to those who possessed faster ships, or carrier pigeons, or private courier networks. The advantage belonged to the speed of physical transport.
But the moment that transatlantic cable goes live, that massive, lucrative information gap is completely obliterated.
Instantly annihilated. The telegraph created a synchronized, unified global market. Stock prices, commodity futures, currency exchange rates, and trade orders moved at the speed of light. The price of gold in London became instantly known on the trading floor in New York. If the price of cotton went up in Manchester, it simultaneously went up in Manhattan. The slow-moving, low-risk arbitrage that built vast fortunes was gone overnight.
The market became hyper-efficient, but also incredibly fragile. I read something fascinating about this era. The global financial system became so deeply structurally reliant on this instant data that a physical break in a transatlantic cable could literally cause market volatility and massive financial disruption until the repair ship could fix it.
It was a terrifying new reality. The global economy had become structurally dependent on the continuous hum of electrical pulses traveling through copper wires lying in the mud. If a trawler snagged a cable off the coast of Ireland, the New York Stock Exchange might panic because they suddenly lacked the data they needed to price their assets. It was the birth of the deeply interconnected, highly volatile financial system we live in today, where a software glitch in a trading server can cause a multi-billion-dollar flash crash in seconds.
It's wild to think that this incredible world-altering copper web hummed along for almost a century, largely unchanged in its fundamental principles.
Yeah.
But as we move into the mid-20th century, the demands of the world shift. People don't just want to tap out dots and dashes in Morse code anymore. They want to hear each other's voices.
A huge technical leap.
Huge. As voice technology evolves, a totally new kind of cable had to be laid. And this new cable set the direct, unalterable physical stage for the internet. Let's jump forward to TT1 and the physical blueprint of the modern world.
We are moving from the telegraph era to the telephone era. And I cannot stress enough how much harder it is to transmit a human voice than it is to transmit a telegraph click. The engineering required for this leap is astounding.
So in 1956, a joint venture between the American, British, and Canadian telecommunications monopolies deploys TT1, which stands for Transatlantic Number 1. This was the first active submarine telephone cable. Why is voice so much harder?
Well, a telegraph is just discrete pulses on or off, voltage or no voltage. It's binary, you can smear it pretty badly and still kind of read it. But the human voice is a highly complex, continuous analog wave. It operates across a wide frequency spectrum. If that analog wave degrades, if it attenuates or gets overwhelmed by background electrical noise, you don't just get a smeared dot, you get complete, unintelligible static. You lose the information entirely.
To make this work, the engineering specs for TAT1 are just staggering. This cable had to carry 36 simultaneous telephone conversations, perfectly clearly, while surviving 6,000 psi of hydrostatic pressure at the bottom of the Atlantic. The specific layers they used, it's like a high-tech, mid-century evolution of the old gutta-percha cable.
It was a marvel of mid-century material science and chemical engineering. They had moved far beyond tree sap.
The anatomy of TAT1 is a masterpiece of defensive engineering. The outermost layer is a thick polyethylene sheath to protect against chemical corrosion. Beneath that, you have heavy, galvanized steel armor wires. Inside the armor, there's a jute and asphalt wrapping for waterproofing. Then, crucially, there's a copper return tape acting as a coaxial shield. Inside that shield is a solid, highly extruded core of polyethylene insulation. And finally, the central copper conductor itself.
The shift from natural gutta-percha to synthetic polyethylene was the critical leap. Polyethylene offered far superior, highly consistent, mathematically predictable dielectric properties. And they needed those perfect properties because they weren't just sending one voice. They were sending dozens of voices simultaneously through a technique called multiplexing.
Let's break down multiplexing, because that's a core concept for how the internet works today. How do you send 36 different people talking over a single copper wire without it just sounding like a chaotic cocktail party?
Think of it like a radio dial. When you turn on your car radio, all the different stations are broadcasting through the air at the exact same time. But they don't interfere with each other because they are broadcasting on different frequencies, 99.5 FM, 101.1 FM, and so on. Your radio tuner filters out everything except the specific frequency you want to hear.
Ah, frequency division multiplexing.
Exactly. At the TAT1 shore station, they took each individual voice call and shifted its pitch, its frequency, up into a higher unique frequency band. They stacked all 36 voices on top of each other, sent them down the single wire as one massively complex wave, and at the receiving station, complex electronic filters separated the frequencies back out and shifted them down to normal voice levels.
That's brilliant.
It is, but to transmit that wide range of high frequencies without them blurring together requires an utterly perfect insulator, which is why polyethylene was mandatory.
But even with perfect polyethylene, the attenuation problem hasn't gone away, right? The analog voice signal still fades over 2,000 miles. You still have to push the signal across the ocean. But they couldn't just use Wildman Whitehouse's 2,000-volt brute force method because that would destroy the complex waves. So what did they do?
They needed amplifiers. And this is the part of Tatu-1 that represents perhaps the greatest unsung engineering triumph of the 20th century. To keep the analog voice signal from fading into static, Tatu-1 required 51 repeaters. These are essentially highly complex electrical amplifiers physically spliced directly into the cable at 40-mile intervals across the entire ocean floor.
Wait, we're talking about 1956. These aren't modern solid-state silicon microchips.
No, these were 1950s vacuum tubes.
It's vacuum tubes.
Yeah.
Like the glowing glass bulbs in an old antique radio or a vintage guitar amplifier. Those things are incredibly fragile. They get incredibly hot, the glass breaks, the filaments burn out constantly.
And the entire Tatu-1 system was powered by a constant 2,000 volts of direct current sent from the shore stations right down the center of the communications cable, specifically to power the glowing filaments in these submerged vacuum tube repeaters.
Let me wrap my head around this. You have 2,000 volts of electricity powering 51 fragile glass vacuum tubes, sitting physically inside the cable, resting 3 miles deep in the freezing ocean mud, under 6,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. If a single one of those glass tubes burns out, the entire transatlantic telephone system goes dead, and you have to send a ship to dredge it up from the abyss to replace a light bulb.
The reliability requirements were completely unprecedented in the history of engineering. The engineers at Bell Labs knew that a failure was economically and logistically unacceptable, so they engineered failure entirely out of the system. They designed highly specific, incredibly robust tubes known as the Western Electric 175 HQ pentodes.
How do you make a vacuum tube invincible?
With a level of quality control bordering on paranoia. The manufacturing facilities were early versions of modern clean rooms. The technicians wore lint-free clothing. Every single component was inspected under microscopes for microscopic flaws. They were hand-assembled by highly trained specialists, and before a tube was allowed to be sealed into a deep-sea repeater, it was relentlessly tested under power for months to ensure the vacuum was perfect and the filament wouldn't degrade.
And what was the result of all that paranoia?
Over the entire 22-year continuous operational lifespan of the TAT-1 cable, buried in the most hostile environment on Earth, not a single one of those vacuum tubes ever failed.
Not a single failure in 22 years. That is unbelievable. And this triumph of TAT-1 brings us right to the present day, to the world of Wi-Fi and cloud computing. Because TAT-1 didn't just carry mid-century phone calls, it laid a geographic and infrastructural pathway that dictates how the internet functions today.
Yes, the path dependency is striking. TAT-1 and its immediate successors mapped the exact physical geographic routes that modern fiber optic internet cables follow right now.
Wait, really? The exact same paths?
Yes. Think about what it takes to lay a cable. You have to negotiate the political landing rights on the beaches. You have to meticulously survey the continental shelf to find a smooth path down to the deep ocean. You have to find routes that avoid deep-sea trenches, underwater volcanoes, and major fishing grounds. The Victorian telegraphers and the mid-century telephone engineers spent decades and millions of dollars surveying and claiming these optimal, safe corridors across the ocean floor.
So when the modern digital internet came along in the 1990s, the tech companies didn't invent a new physical map of the world.
No, they didn't have to. The internet essentially hijacked this painstakingly negotiated, physically trenched global infrastructure. When we upgraded from the copper coaxial cables of TAT-1 to the modern laser-driven glass threads of fiber optics, the modern cable-laying ships literally unspooled the new fiber along the exact same paths forged by the 19th century gutta-percha lines. The entire digital revolution is completely reliant on the geographical rights-of-way established by analog pioneers.
But there's a very dark side to this path dependency, isn't there? Because these cables have to come ashore somewhere. You can't just plug the ocean into a Wi-Fi router. The cables land at specific beaches and then travel underground to specific buildings. And this creates massive physical geopolitical choke points.
This is perhaps the most critical vulnerability of our modern age. Because of how the historical routes were established by Western powers, the vast majority of intercontinental fiber optic internet traffic terminates in a handful of massive, highly secure, deeply unassuming buildings known as carrier hotels.
Carrier hotels, where are they?
They're predominantly located in Western nations, places like Lower Manhattan in New York, massive data centers in London, or Frankfurt in Germany.
So if I'm in South America and I'm sending an email to someone in Africa, There's a very good chance that data packet travels up a fiber optic cable, physically lands in a building in Miami or New York, gets routed, and goes back under the ocean to Africa. All the global data gets funneled into these highly concentrated specific buildings on Western soil.
Yes. And this physical concentration grants the host nations immense, unparalleled geopolitical leverage. It provides centralized opportunities for global surveillance, data collection, and traffic interception. Intelligence agencies don't need to hack into individual computers if they have physical access to the carrier hotel where the nation's data lands. Furthermore, if you control the physical landing site of a submarine cable, you possess the terrifying potential to monitor, throttle, or even entirely sever the data flow of an entire sovereign nation with a pair of bolt cutters. We love to talk about the internet feeling decentralized in the software layer, like a cloud, but in the physical foundational layer, it is highly centralized, highly physical, and incredibly vulnerable.
So what does this all mean for us? We've gone from Victorian chips snapping cables to the genius of measuring resistance to find breaks, to vacuum tubes surviving in the abyss, all the way to massive fiber optic hubs in Manhattan. When you look at your smartphone today, when you tap an icon to access a file in the cloud, you aren't pulling it out of the air. The cloud is actually just a vast, incredibly fragile network of armored tubes lying in the freezing mud at the bottom of the ocean.
To synthesize this incredible journey, it started with the gooey sap of the gutta-percha tree in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It evolved through the lethal, arrogant, 2,000-volt mistakes of early engineers. It forced the creation of error-correcting digital code to survive the capacitance of the sea. And it culminated in perfectly engineered vacuum tubes resting flawlessly in the abyss. Humanity's relentless drive to connect conquered the most hostile environment on Earth. In doing so, these pioneers created both the discrete digital logic of binary code and the exact physical pathways that form the absolute backbone of the modern internet. The internet isn't a magical new phenomenon. It is simply the latest iteration in a 150-year physical war against the friction of distance and the crushing weight of the sea.
It completely changes how you look at a Wi-Fi router. I don't think I'll ever look at the internet the same way again. Thank you to everyone listening for coming along on this deep dive with us today. We hope it gave you some massive aha moments and a profound new appreciation for the hidden, gritty, physical machinery of our world.
It's been an absolutely fascinating exploration.
And we want to leave you with one final thought to ponder as you go about your day. The next time you seamlessly stream a high-definition video from another continent, or transfer money internationally from your phone, think about the immense physical vulnerability of that connection. If the vast majority of the global economy, our financial markets, our military logistics, and our collective human knowledge rests on just a few glass fiber optic threads resting entirely unprotected in the mud on the ocean floor. Wait, sorry, let me restart that thought. Resting entirely unprotected in the mud on the ocean floor, what happens when the deep sea becomes the next active frontier for geopolitical sabotage?
A truly chilling but entirely necessary question for our times.
We'll leave you to think on that. Thanks for joining us, and keep diving deep.